Jovi.
Yeah.
That would never have happened in the United States, ever. As big as they were, because their record sales had been declining steadily in the States, they still had a huge audience coming to see them live.
Right.
That would never have happened with Van Halen opening for them.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem all that surprising because Bon Jovi always had an international popularity that Van Halen did not. I know from a U.S. perspective, people are like, I can't believe Van Halen opened up for Bon Jovi. But across the pond, it probably wasn't all that surprising because Bon Jovi was still very popular and Van Halen really wasn't because they hadn't cultivated their popularity internationally outside the United States. For me, it seems like a logical move once you get past the bias of Bon Jovi.
I agree with that, but the more illogical thing was them ignoring that part of the world for so long. I think it really damaged them that they didn't tour there more often.
Yeah.
And in 1984, they should have been touring there. They should have been trying to cultivate that audience. And I know they gave up years before that, and they didn't go over there for a couple years. But in 1984, they should have gone back, and they should have done a big tour, made it a big production. We're back in Europe. This is our biggest album. And they didn't do it. It was almost like a token, here you go, we'll show up at the festival and we'll be second or third on the bill, or we'll share headlining with whoever. But they didn't show enough love to those audiences there, and they remember that. You always hear about bands trying to break in America, bands that maybe were in Brit pop or whatever that never were able to do it. But it's so much easier to break in the UK because it's so much smaller. And yet Van Halen just kind of gave up on it.
I also wanted to ask you, the song Between Us Two. Sammy has mentioned that he thought that song was phenomenal, and he also mentioned that it was finished. Why do you think that they didn't include that on the Twister soundtrack, but chose to go with Respect the Wind?
I know that Eddie and Alex didn't think that it was finished. Sammy did. They weren't going to kowtow to anything that Sammy did. So if they, even out of spite, if they kept that off of the Twister soundtrack, it was because they didn't think it was done. I mean, humans being, they had to finish that up on their own. I mean, Eddie had to lay down so many of the backing vocals on his own. Whatever state that was in, that song Between Us Two, whatever that was in that Sammy thinks is finished, Eddie just wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to. Sammy said it's finished. I guess it's finished. At that point in his life, at that point in the career of Van Halen, he wanted to take the reins, and he was saying, no, that song's done when I say it's done. And even if it is out of spite, we're going to do this song. It's just a duo. We're going to do Respect the Wind. Credit it to Edward and Alex Van Halen.
And it's so funny because in the press, Sammy was really drumming up that song like, oh, it was this classic that they just left on the cutting room floor. And it was like, we worked so hard on it. And it was really so good. And it's completely done. And I mean, why would you not want a whole second Van Halen song as opposed to just a quick, instrumental? It just didn't make any sense. Wanted to ask you, do you think Sam was forced to quit? Did you get that feeling?
Again, it goes back to Eddie wanting to take more control of the band. And I don't think he had grown out of his partnership with Sammy. I do think that it became one of those things where you don't seem as dedicated to the band anymore. And you could argue that maybe he wasn't, but he wanted it to be more of, all right, we're not in our 20s anymore, or in Sammy's case, in his early 30s. We're not going to go out and party and get crazy every night. I'm going to try and build this new life that I have with a new woman, getting married, trying to have a baby with her, and that's going to be my family. And Van Halen, you're still going to be my number one. You're going to be my job. You're going to be my band. But for Van Halen, it's got to be a lifestyle. You got to be ready to come at their beck and call. That's the whole band. Sammy wasn't a part of that anymore. I don't think what Sammy wanted was unreasonable, but I think that it was unreasonable what Van Halen wanted. I don't think they forced him out. I think that they wanted him to give something that he couldn't give and wouldn't give.
Yeah, good point. So now, one thing I thought was really interesting in the book, page 167, where Van Halen asked for $2.5 million for a new song for the Howard Stern Private Parts soundtrack. New song with Dave, of course. Do you think that was a pie-in-the-sky offer that they just sort of threw that crazy number out there?
I mean, who's going to spend that type of money for one song?
Right.
But when people say that Ray Daniels didn't have his eye on the money and how he could make the most money on the band, I point to something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, if he got that money, if they said, okay, we'll give you that money, he goes back to Van Halen, he looks like a wizard. I can't believe he's bringing us that much for one song. And they needed, I mean, especially Alex at the time, he needed it. I mean, he was going through a divorce, he had just gone through a divorce, but because now Ray Daniels was his brother-in-law.
Right.
He was still recovering from his last divorce. And financially, if they're going to bring in that kind of money, they'll do anything for that. But yeah, was it a pie in the sky? You're not getting 2 million for a song on a $30 million movie.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I don't think that Ray Daniels' problem as a manager was finding opportunities for the band to help them out financially. He was always trying to do that. Do you think that Ray's struggle was in managing the band itself because they needed a lot more hand-holding than Rush did?
Yeah, I mean, it was not for a lack of finding opportunities. He definitely found them the opportunities, but he needed that interpersonal thing that I think maybe someone like an Ed Loeffler did give to the band. I mean, I don't even know if Ed Loeffler was managing any other bands. I mean, Ray Daniels he was all over the place. I don't think Eddie Van Halen wants to hear, yeah, Eddie, I can't come to the studio and talk stuff with you that day. I got to be up in Canada and dealing with Rush. Or I got to go back in Boston and talk to the guys in Extreme. Eddie doesn't want to hear that.
Yeah,
he needs, again, like his singers, he needs that attention. He needs that, come at the drop of a hat. And you're not going to get that with a manager that's, splitting his time between a bunch of different bands, especially bands at the stature of Rush.
Right. So now, do you think in 1996 at the VMAs and that whole best of situation that Van Halen was leading Dave on? So now, how could he not know what was going on? Was David Lee Roth truly a quote-unquote unwitting participant?
I think that Dave had blinders on. I really do. I think that if any of what went down the way it's been reported did go down that night, and he shows up on Stern the next week talking like everything's going great, and he's still, I mean, that's just, it's denial. It's having blinders on, or maybe it's just being overly optimistic that, hey, we fought in the past, we can work this out. And at that point, he didn't realize how much maybe Eddie had changed. And he thought it was just going to be, well, we fought before, we've gotten in arguments before, Eddie's threatened me before, whether he did or didn't, who knows. I don't think that he knew, especially after the reaction they got, which is going to go to anybody's head, I think. I don't think he thought that they were really going to move on with another singer.
Yeah, and Gary claimed he watched the whole VMAs from Eddie's guest house.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Which is wild. And Mitch Malloy claims that he, at the time, thought he was in the band. That whole period is that's the most, I would love to write a book just call it Van Halen 1996.
Right, I know.
And examine that whole year.
It's unbelievable.
Mitch Malloy thought he was in the band that night, and then the next day he's faxing over, I regret to inform you, I won't be joining Van Halen. Gary's in the guest house. It's so nuts.
It is. I've seen people on websites try and map out the timeline of where everybody allegedly was at the time to try and figure out who was in the band and if Ed and management knew what was going on, what was yanking people's chains, and just seeing what happens. You're right. It's such a crazy time.
And I do believe that Gary was at the guest house at the time. I do believe that he was working on music. Maybe he'd been out there a week. Maybe he'd been out there 2 weeks. I don't know. But I believe that he was working with them. I believe Ed told him, look, we got to go do this promotional thing for the best of. That's all it is. Talk about an unwitting participant. How, in anybody's mind, do you think that walking out there with your old singer that the fans loved, that part of the band, after 10 years away, is not going to draw conclusions that you've reunited? Oh, we were just promoting the record like we did any record. I mean, I think that's what Alex said. No, you don't do that. You don't go out there with your old singer. You didn't walk out with Dave for Live Right Here, Right Now and say, oh, well, there's a couple Dave songs on the record, so we're walking out with him. That's not the way they played it.
Do you think that Ed had blinders on? Because Ed went in there and said, we're going to go on stage, present an award, and tell people Dave's doing a couple of songs. We are looking for a new lead singer, and I need a new hip. We don't know what we are doing yet. That's the story, and we are going to stick to it. Everybody will accept it, and it will be fine. I really think Ed went in there believing, I think this way, so everybody else will think this way. The problem is he was such a unique individual, and not everybody thinks like that. Wasn't it Dave who said, Ed, this is the only thing people are going to be talking about, and we better have an answer?
They were on the way over there, and Eddie said, look, No matter what happens, all we're doing is talking about the 2 new songs. And Dave said something along the lines of, the press corps is going to want to talk about everything except those 2 songs.
Yeah,
and that's what happened, and that's when it fell apart. I don't know how Eddie could be shocked by that, but he does have a very insular way of thinking. I don't know what he thought was going to happen after that night.
He's not press savvy. He never has been. Dave is. Dave knows what to lead with and all these different, like, he knows the medium. So now, do you think that whole 1996 botched situation caused Van Halen to be cursed moving forward in the sense that the fans got so jerked around that they had enough, and that's why Van Halen 3 really never had a shot?
I don't think that was going to have a shot with a third singer, even if they hadn't got back with Dave. I really don't see Van Halen happening with a third singer, no matter who it is.
Yeah.
You're just asking lightning to strike too many times. It's not going to work. But by bringing Dave out there, they completely sabotaged anything that was going to happen with Gary. Could they have handled that a lot differently? Of course. They should have never gone in and made the album first. They should have gone out, did a tour, test the waters, get to know each other as mutual artists. As far as the fans go, you're like, all right, Sammy's out. That's going to piss off enough of the fan base. Dave's back. Oh, this is great. Wait, yeah. Dave's not back? And you got this guy, the guy from Extreme. Most of them know him only from More Than Words? No way. I think people checked out at that point.
What do you think would have happened had they hired Mitch instead?
Would have gone worse.
Really?
At least people knew who Gary was. With Mitch Malloy, you're bringing in a complete unknown. He doesn't have any fan base that carries over.
Right.
I mean, Extreme's fan base is much, much smaller than Van Halen's, but very dedicated. So at least Gary's got a little bit of recognition. Even if you only know him as the More Than Words guy, you know who he is. Then bringing in somebody that's just a complete unknown, I mean, maybe if they waited a little while and they would have had sort of the same thing that Journey was able to do, but I don't see how it works. You don't bring an unknown into that band.
There's an interesting quote on page 191 in your book from Michael Anthony. He says, as much as he wasn't the perfect fit for Van Halen, it was something Ray Daniels kind of forced upon us, and then Ed became really good friends with him. It was a really weird time for us. So do you think that because Gary was Ray Daniels' client, that he was kind of pushing Ed in that direction?
Oh, I think so. I definitely think so. It worked out for him financially. I know he was Alex's brother-in-law and everything, but he didn't really have an emotional stake in that band. He's a manager in this management company, the SRO management. He's there to make money from this band and do it any way that he can. If it's a milk ad, if it's a best of collection, whatever it's going to be. And if things are definitely not going to work out with Dave in a reunion, well, let's get another singer, but let's get one that I manage. And, yeah, I think he definitely pushed that on him.
Why do you think that Ed maligned Michael Anthony so much and diminished his role in the band? Even on Van Halen 3, he's only on 3 songs. When they do the reunion with Hagar, he's not even on the new songs. They had to negotiate to get him on the tour. He's paid like a hired hand. I mean, what the hell do you think that's all about?
I mean, he's the most unassuming, laid-back guy you're ever going to meet is Michael Anthony. I don't understand why, unless it's one of those things where you see somebody who's weaker than you and you look at that as a weak link and you don't want a weak link in your band. And by being just a stand-up guy who didn't cause any trouble with anybody and just kind of did whatever you told him and didn't have a voice, maybe Eddie saw that as being a weak link. You know, I'm just armchair therapy here. I don't know, because that's the only thing to me that makes sense. It's not like Michael was trying to steal the spotlight or trying to go off and do a solo record or talking bad about Eddie in the press. I mean, he just did anything that Eddie ever wanted him to do. I mean, Noel Monk said it in his book, and he said it to me. You know, why they would keep shitting on this guy over and over again is beyond me. I mean, they took away his dignity. I feel bad for him, but maybe he didn't stand up for himself. The way Noel Monk paints it in his book is that when they wanted to take away his royalties from 1984 that he'd already gotten and move forward with that, he was just like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's at some point you got to stand up for yourself and say, no, that's not the way it's going to work.
Right, that's true. Garrick does a quote in your book at page 195 where he says, "The songs, if we nurtured them, I think there was a few gems on that record. It was rushed in a sense that we didn't write enough material for it. We really became a band after the tour. If I was going to do it all over again, it would have been great if I had joined the band, went on tour, played some hits, and then maybe a new song or two, then do a record. And then maybe there would have been a better chance for an audience to embrace a third singer." But they had a good year and a half before that album was released. I mean, from the VMAs in 1996 to when the album came out on St. Patrick's Day in 1998, that's a lot of time. Do you think that's just an excuse?
I think that the times had changed from when Sammy entered the band, and